The European Parliament has just published its amendments to the European Commission's proposal for a Covered Bond Directive. It's obviously something of great significance for the covered bond market and raises quite a few controversial points ahead of the Euromoney Covered Bond Forum in Munich in September. So to discuss this with me is Luca Bertalot, Secretary General of the European Covered Bond Council. Luca, thank you very much for joining us.
Good morning.
So let's cut to the chase. What is it about this proposal that worries you the most?
Well, the first concern of the industry is respecting the timeline. I think we are all aware that we have a clear deadline, which is February 2019, and we have still a long process in front of us. The ECON, and the Economic and Monetary Affairs of the European Parliament, has to discuss the proposal of the rapporteur, Mr. Luca, and we have a few intense weeks of discussion before the final vote, most probably end of November, in the ECON committee. And then the three institutions of the European Commission, of the European Union, the European Commission, the Council and the Parliament will discuss to achieve a common proposal which most probably will be voted in Q1 2019.
Ahead of the elections, which obviously is the final line.
So the major risk that we see is to create element of complexity in the legislative debate and a potential postponement of the final approval of this package, which I would like to recall, after the approval of the European Parliament, we have 12 months of national implementation, because the directive has to be implemented in every single member state in the next 12 months.
So we could be looking at it actually coming into force in every member state, what, February 2020, as early as that, yes, potentially?
Hopefully, yes. No. And only at that very moment, the directive will become operational, will become effective, and also the regulation will become effective only on that moment.
Right. One of the dominant things in Mr. Luca's proposal for this was concerning the two-tier covered bond market, let's call it, with premium covered bonds and ordinary covered bonds. That's something that the Commission ignored, but they did have the idea of European secured notes, which is sort of similar. What do you think about the two-tier structure? And can I ask, what's the difference between an ordinary covered bond and an ESN?
Well, I think that Article 6 is the crucial part of the directive, because will be the lighthouse for national countries to implement.
Article 6 is where we define assets.
Exactly, the eligibility criteria for covered bonds. And it's a critical point, because it is where the two schools of thoughts of the covered bond industry have to find a compromise. There is a very conservative side of the covered bond industry saying, let's keep covered bonds very poor, let's avoid any kind of contagious risk, and let's not watering down the quality of this asset class, because we need to keep investor base happy and able to consider this asset class as the highest qualitative benchmark into the market. And then there is a second school of thought saying, this is a very important mechanism, we should use this for our strategic assets. And I think the compromise could be to use two different names and making a distinction between a real covered bond and simply using a technique. The Commission proposed at that time to use only covered bonds, so they had a very conservative approach. But at that time, we have to say, the ESN discussion was very premature. There was no advice of the European Banking Authority, and there was no impact assessment done by private consultancy. I think this point in time is a bit different. The European Banking Authority has given their view in July, and we know that the work of the consultancy is on its way and should be arriving into the market very shortly. So the idea of the ESN can be included and actually could complement also the spirit of the Capital Markets Union, which was opening the door to financing the real economy, growth, and also what is very important, what is missing, I think, in the Covered Bond Directive is a reference to energy efficiency or sustainable assets, which is also another very important pillar of the European Commission agenda. So those are the two things which are clashing actually in Article 6. It's really the Gordian knot of this directive, and the proposal of Luca is opening the two tiers. It's not clear exactly what is in the second tier. I mean, the industry is debating. It's inclusive of all the covered bond already existing or not, the ordinary covered bonds. This is we are still analyzing, and maybe also Munich will be the occasion to discuss this with all the market participants.
And the proposal for the ordinary covered bonds is very much agnostic as to the assets. It doesn't specify it, but when Commission asked the question, ESNs were in the context just of loans to small and medium-sized enterprises and infrastructure loans. But yeah, you're right. For example, the new green loans that are proposed as part of the Luxembourg proposals probably ought to be included in that explicitly.
Yeah, I mean, my personal view is that even though the rapporteur is saying that the concept of ESN has to be included in this category, ordinary covered bond, I don't see actually room for SME or poor cash flow models in that set of eligibility criteria, which is Article 6A. And I don't see room for sustainable assets, and for sure not for infrastructure. So the question is, what is included exactly in that category and what is not included?
Now, another really controversial area of the proposals from Parliament is the treatment of extendable maturity structures. Yeah. We knew that there were going to be more, or expected that there were going to be proposals for more disclosure, for higher standards, for defining the trigger events for those extensions. I think one thing that shocked me when I read the proposal was that it would have a higher risk weight for longer dated conditional pass-through structures. Do you think that's justified? Do you think that it's likely to make it to the final text?
Well, I think that this will be one of the topics that will be discussed now in the Econ. There are different views. Conditional pass-through and soft bullet, they represented a very important part of the market in the last years, mitigating quite importantly the liquidity risk for issuers, so compressing funding cost for issuers, and this was very important for country, I would say, in the south part of Europe. So if the covered bonds should be an instrument to facilitate access to capital markets in crisis time, I think for sure extended maturity is an important characteristic. But I will define this as a soft characteristic, not as an hard characteristic. Doesn't change the nature of the covered bond product. And this, I think, was demonstrated by the fact that investors, they really welcome this instrument. They ask no premia for this kind of instrument. And it is simply, if you go to the market, you want to have an apple. The apple can be green, yellow, or red. It depends from the investor perspective. But it's always an apple. And I don't think that there is a structural difference between the key characteristic of a hard bullet covered bond and a soft bullet covered bond. So we have to be very careful not to put this in an artificial risk category, which will give a strong signal to investors that this is something different.
I agree, but the discussion that in the paper, in the explanatory note, talks about greater risk characteristics of it, and perhaps there are some things that conditional pass-throughs could do to address those concerns, more disclosure, for example.
Yes, I think that there is a role for the industry. We have to work on harmonizing a bit more, I would say, what does it mean conditional pass-through and what are the key characteristics. Because if we make this characteristic a bit more harmonized at the European level and more transparent for investors, I think that we can increase the comfort of the investor community and also the regulators. Because I think that there is a call from the European institution to for the industry to play a role in making sure that the conditional pass-through is harmonized around Europe and maybe also behind Europe. And we have to take this call and we have to react in the right way by having a task force. We already have as a CBCA task force. We already proposed to the European Commission a common definition, and that's, I think, where the industry should focus energies in the coming months.
It feels a little bit like the conversation we had years ago about the covered bond label. In 2009, was it, when we were asked the question, we produced this concept of a covered bond label. Perhaps we need to do a similar process with conditional pass-throughs.
Yes, and that's, I think, a very interesting comparison, because in the plenary meeting in Copenhagen, Michel Stubbe from the European Central Bank raised the question to the industry, and he asked to have a covered bond label. Actually, the market reacted very quickly, and after only 3 years, the market initiative, the covered bond label, was fully operational, and we were able to give a strong signal to the market after 10 years from that moment, we are still waiting for the directive. So, I mean, we have to not to underestimate the capacity of the market to give strong signals, strong responses to input of the European institutions. So I think that there is a role for the industry also to give a strong response in terms of conditional pass-through and soft bullet, I would say, characteristics.
Yeah. I don't want to come across as too negative. There are some very positive aspects of the proposals, and one that I particularly enjoyed was about the proposal to start on the third-party equivalence rules straight away rather than have a 3-year delay like Commission proposed. I think clearly our friends from Singapore and Canada should be very supportive of that.
Yes, indeed. I mean, this is a strong signal to make the equivalence system, I think, more robust, and will improve for sure the benchmark as a point of reference for the global development of covered bonds. In Munich, we will have a strong Brazilian delegation that will be coming and present their legislation. In Malaysia, they are discussing about covered bonds, and in Japan now there are some movements around the covered bonds. So it's a global story, and of course, this proposal of Mr. Luca will reinforce this role. We have also to give time to these countries to implement the regulatory package that we have in Europe. For example, exclusion from bail-in is a topic that has to be addressed in those countries. Repo eligibility rules should be comparable with the European standards. So I think it is nice that the rapporteur is giving a strong signal, and this can, I will say, help in implementing covered bonds around the globe.
A little bit like this time last year when the Basel Committee finally recognised the concept of covered bonds on a global scale for the first time. It's just a message, but it's a great message, really.
Yes, and we see very concrete action after only a few months from that declaration with Brazil. It's the example of having a concrete legislation in place in a very important country in South America.
Well, I'm certainly all for that. Now, going back to the proposal, though, it's on the table now. We've got a very tight deadline. When do amendments have to be made to it, and what's the process between here and then?
Yes, amendment has to be tabled by MEPs on the 25th of September. So actually our plenary meeting in Munich will be the last chance for the industry to raise and to be vocal on concern, because after this deadline the discussion will happen between the different MEPs, and a final vote is scheduled for the end of November in the Econ Committee. After this, as I said before, the trilogue will start, so the position of the European Parliament will be discussed together with the position of the European Council, representing the Member States of the European Union, and the initial proposal of the European Commission. From this different version, from these 3 different versions, we will have one common version, which will then be voted by the European Parliament, probably in February 2019, right before the European election of 2019.
So the timing of Munich couldn't be better, really?
Yes, we are very lucky, and we invite all our members to be very vocal on their concerns.
Looking forward to it. Luca, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you, Richard.